Hello, and welcome to the FluCoMa podcast. Today I'm talking with Laetitia Sonami, who is a sound artist, performer, and researcher. Laetitia's work is in electronic music, comes in many forms, from performances to installations to the conception of bespoke instruments that merge intimate gestural reflection with cutting-edge technologies and intricate sound design. Her work has been heard and seen all over the world. She's won numerous awards over the course of her career, and she's given lectures and workshops at a great number of academic and artistic institutions. Today, we'll be learning more about her practice, notably her approach to instrument design. Laetitia has been using technologies such as neural network regression as part of her instrument making for many years, and we'll be discussing her approach to training and how she maps gesture and sound. We'll be talking about several of her instruments, notably her lady's glove, an instrument that spans over 5 versions and was developed over 25 years. We'll take this opportunity to look back at its development and discover how it grew and how Laetitia incorporated new technologies into the system. So, Laetitia, hello, and thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You're quite welcome. So perhaps you could begin by talking about how you got into the musical world and specifically that of electronic music and instrument design.
Okay, well, let's see. I pretty much went right into electronic music. I was going to art school. I was like 17, right after the baccalaureate in Boston. They had a synthesizer, a Putney, a VCS3. And I was like so puzzled, and that you could actually make sounds with electricity, kind of like, very naive, but I'm still actually puzzled, I must say, about it 40 years later. And so then I decided to continue because I really did not understand. I thought, well, if I'm going to do something, I should probably do something I don't understand, which seems to be a recurring pattern, always going to what I can't make sense of. So it's very attractive. And then met, when I was in Paris, became a student of Eliane Radig, who is this wonderful, amazing French composer. And she had an ARP 2500 there in her apartment. So I stayed with her for a year and then came back to, went back to America because that was pretty much according to her, and probably, there's not that much freedom in France to explore at the time. So it was always this quest for the analog, electronic, and eventually digital sound. So sometimes now, after all these years, I wonder, do I actually care so much about music? I'm not sure. But I do care about, I think, the magic of technology. Seems to be guiding and how it expresses itself in sound. But so I think that the media was quite important, more than the music.
Yeah. So talking about this kind of idea of the sounds and the sound world, before we talk about your instrument design, I'd like to kind of frame things by having a quick discussion about that, even if the two are inherently linked. So you've got some interesting views on synthesis and machine learning, which we'll get back to later. But I was wondering if you could describe the kinds of sounds you like to create. Do you have a general approach to synthesis? Do you make much use of pre-recorded content? And sort of generally, how do you go about curating the sounds that we'll hear during a performance or an installation?
Well, I think it has changed quite a bit over the time I've performed. I think originally it was all whatever I had built the synth from kits in the early 80s, and so a lot is what the instrument can do, playing around it. And I used to sample a lot and record a lot, and then I pretty much stopped. And then I was really into voice, and actually the glove came along with the idea of using speech. And then eventually I got into, I always did synthesis, but obviously when I first started Max, I had gotten Max was a cracked copy of IRCAM. Somebody had IRCAM, had said, there's these guys working on this, you should check it out. So it was just Max, since you had to control the sampler and the synths. But so actually with Max MSP, which is, I guess, the platform I use, where you could actually do real-time synthesis, then I got more into that. But as far as what the sounds, what attracts me, it really changed. The sounds is pretty much what guides me. I sometimes wish I had an idea, a great composer's idea of like what this is going to be. But it's really about just kind of like hunter-gatherer kind of psychology. I just kind of, I try to find a platform which obviously will allow me to explore, hence eventually when we talk about machine learning. But originally it was just looking at patches, just playing around until I find a sound that attracts me. Once I'm attracted to that sound, I kind of start, I keep on, and I actually try not to make sense, and I try not to coagulate too fast. I try to just keep on gathering. And it used to stress me out, like, oh, I have so many things that don't really connect. How will I perform with this? But then I realized that you're still just one person. It may seem like it's totally disconnected. There's obviously a thread. So then I try to thread those things that appear to be disparate. So a lot is threading these things I find and attracted by anything. I think, and sometimes you're attracted by really stupid, silly things, sometimes not. So it's but that's the only thing I can trust, is what I'm attracted to, and then try to make sense of it. Long answer to your question.
No, it's great. So kind of getting this idea of the instrument as something that's going to be kind of quite open, that's going to allow for this kind of exploration of
it's essential. Yeah,
great. Yeah, well, we'll certainly be touching back on that again. But just before, I'm really curious to hear also about the physicalities of your process. So you talked about Max MSP there. I really like hearing about the different environments people operate in, which creative coding environments and why. And also, you do a lot of physical instrument building or instrument/controller building. So I was wondering also, is there maybe an ethos behind the materials that go into your physical configurations? And if you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, the gesture, if we talk about physicality, I guess we talk about gestures, and what the instrument will allow me to do pretty much guides a lot of how obviously I will perform, but also what kind of sounds I will control. So, and that only started with physicality. Only started in like in 91 when I started thinking about. I mean, it seems like a long time ago. It is, but how to. There was a physicality with the synth and the mixing and the cassettes. And then eventually, obviously, when there was like the computer, that physicality was, how to create a physicality. And what is the need of physicality? I think I did not really envision too much, but what was the behind physicality? But now I think that physicality seems to be not so much how to say, a way to legitimize what I was doing, which is maybe how it started. I'm actually moving and it's making a sound, Now I think the physicality is more really inscribed in the way I make sounds. So when I changed instrument, that was a big point. There was many reasons, but I think that the physicality is so linked to the synthesis that the glove obviously had a lot of like very particular gestures that I could do, but there's some gestures I could not do. So that means I could not do those sounds. I could not just have drones, or like steady sounds, because what do I do? Just listen. So I always had this kind of tension of trying to, I guess, somehow validate the gesture, but not validate too much. And then how the gesture is in the sound. And now more and more, I realize sound is about gesture. And I guess I wasn't thinking about it before, but now I think sound is inherently gesture.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the people that were one of the commissioned artists on the FluCoMa project, Rodrigo Constanzo, who he also put a lot of time into the developing of his physical object, which was in this case a crossfader that he'd set up with a condenser microphone and a snare. And yeah, I remember him telling me that you could hear the crossfader in the sound, and not just at a local sound level, but also the kind of macroscopic gestural vocabulary and the whole piece.
It's interesting. I don't think it's like, a rule, because obviously there's great music where the gestures might be obscured. But anyway, that's how I think about it.
I mean, it's certainly not a rule, but it does seem to strike me that with artists that work in the digital domain, this question of physicality does come up quite a lot, because some people are trying to find the physicality back. And
and I think that I mean, it used to be, I guess I'm thinking about how I control, but more and more I realize the body has in a way a logic, and then I don't know how to say it, because there's an intelligence to the body, or there's the way the body apprehend sounds or the world is very different from how the brain apprehends it. I mean, I'm kind of going in unknown territory here, but I think that obviously, we strive to put it together. So I think that the physicality, in a way, evolved to be not just, again, a way to validate or a way to control or a way to, but more just a way to actually add a logic that I did not have access to, in a more linear kind of like programmatic way. Suddenly it was like, how do I bypass as much as possible my brain, which I think is what actually acoustic musicians do, is like, you have this kind of like, fusion, or you don't think about what you're going to do. So I think that's maybe trying to do that, trying not to think.
Yeah. And so obviously these kind of ideas are going to be at the very heart of your instrument design, and kind of your relationship with objects that are going to allow for that kind of relationship to emerge. So along those lines, I'd love to talk about your Lady's Glove project.
Yeah.
So in the past, you described it as your signature instrument. So as I mentioned at the beginning, it was a long-term project that's been discontinued now. We'll get back to that in a bit later. But so it started in 1991 and span over 5 different iterations. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear about the instrument from a historical perspective. So to try and learn about how it grew over the years. Maybe you could begin by explaining the context of its initial creation, what you were wanting to achieve, and how Lady's Glove Mark I worked.
Mark I. First, I don't know if I'm the one who says it was my signature instrument, but maybe I did. But I think it's definitely it's a kind of the love of my life. But I don't know if it's like a signature. But anyway, I have to think about that. But yeah, no, it started as a just a need, I mean, it's really Paul de Marinis, who's this really incredible artist. We were performing, and I was just starting to use the computer, I think, or sample. I forget exact. No, I think we had the each a computer, and I was like, what am I going to do? So and I actually pulled out the various things, but just to entertain your audience. But this was the, at the time there was the power glove, right?
Yeah.
And then so we could hack the sensors, and I was like, well, okay. He said, well, let's, I think, I thought of a glove or whatever it is, but he was really a great inspiration to get me going, because I didn't know exactly how to do. I think it was, it was a fourth board and a few switches, and I got this. And then I think it's falling apart. But so anyway, it was just like, this is the first one. It's a very interesting landscape at this point in time, because it's totally falling apart. But there's a few switches, 5 switches. So, I could talk, because I was trying to use text. So I could talk, and I could just go, like this. There was a magnet on the other one. So I could go like this. And so there was this kind of nice, fast, kind of action. And I could just look at the public and talk to them. It was about slaughterhouses. It was called Mechanization Takes Command. So it was a very kind of abrupt piece. And then I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So then I made the second one. We always want more. There's never a question about that. It's like people say, oh, how can I make it more complicated? I said, don't worry. It's just the way things go. So then I made the second one. It was still like, my second one has a few more switch, and then it has like, I think some Hall effects sensor. So it got more complex, and I made another one. At this point, my cousin, who worked in the film industry as a costume designer, I knew this person who could make gloves to my hand. So that's one of my biggest criticism of people making gloves now. I say, God, your gloves are so ugly. It's like, at least make them pretty. So I'm very snob about this. And so this, and then eventually time. So obviously my thinking grew with the instrument. It was more like, well, it's not just going to be about triggering. Obviously, I was just triggering sample with the Hall effects, but it's like, well, maybe I could just change. Again, it was just max, not max MSP. I could just kind of like control the parameters, speeds and whatever. And so then Stein, Michel Weislich at Stein, who was really supportive of artists who were doing unique instruments, from a long time. I don't know if you know the Stein Institute, but it's in Amsterdam. It was an amazing place, which unfortunately I think does not exist. But they were building things, and they had made a controller called the Sensor Lab. And because we didn't have controllers, we didn't have A-to-Ds and D-to-As, easy, accessible A-to-Ds. So they had made this Sensor Lab. You could have 32 switches, 64 switches, 32 analog input. And so they sponsored another glove. So I made another glove, and I added a lot more. And I was thinking at the time to hide, because I was thinking about hiding, because again, this idea of magic. And I was thinking, well, I wanted to hide it. But then this is Bert Bongers. Bert Bongers took my design from the number 3, and then he greatly improved it and made number 4 and number 5. He's an artist, engineer. He lives in Australia now. And he was one of the only person I had encountered who really had this kind of idea of some kind of aesthetics, of how things should look, and color of the wires and color of the shrink wrap. So we built this, he built this, and and then eventually Stein sponsored the last one, which is number 5, which is about the same, but it's just more mature looking. It's got kind of silver, instead of blue. It's less, it's more mature. And then so I just kept adding. And this one has a wrist that has a bit more sensors. And this was all going to the sensor lab. So by this point, I kind of had my desires grew, my desires just expanded, like, and then so I kept thinking of other sensors. Not that there's not that many sensors, but and then I started inhabiting this space, and I think I started. I said in one of my papers, I think I merged with the glove. We merged, and that's why I say it's one of my love story. Because I was definitely this. It's very strange to explain. It was part of my body, and I get almost emotional if I have to wear it again. It's just like it's so many years, and it's so much what allowed me to go where I went. Not that it was that, obviously it's a nightmare to program, but it still was my imagination and thinking about, again, this idea of sound and gesture and what's the relation to body, of body to sound. And I discovered it all because of this instrument.
Yeah. I'm wondering, because so you mentioned there briefly that it's a nightmare to code, and I wonder if one thing that struck me when some of the other systems that the FluCoMa artists made was so with programming and creative programming, we have these systems that build up often quite iteratively, and here we have these different iterations of a thing, and at the beginning we have a lot of control about what they're doing, and we know that this does this and this does this, but then there comes a point perhaps where we kind of realize that things are working almost on their own, and kind of we're adding on to this system, but we're kind of having to find how we can insert things into it despite another part that's moving. And it's just, I was wondering how that kind of the agency that glove is obtaining, how that kind of grows over the years, and how you approach kind of trying to insert new things into it, because as you say, you always want more and you're always trying to develop. And so talk about maybe that relationship of
it's interesting. I think that things have changed so much since 91, I guess, also in as far as like expectation, and I think that also as a woman, I think obviously it had to be reliable to be trusted. From an audience perspective, it was always like, well, you did this and it did that. Now you did this and it didn't do that. So obviously it's not working, and you go, yeah, that's kind of what I wanted, but I think that the agency changes, or the idea of agency changes. And I think that ultimately you kind of want to have this necessity for adaptation. You kind of want to have the instrument talking back to you and making you adapt to its restrictions. And I think more and more now, I'm kind of like, when I teach, I'm often saying, what are the boundaries? Find the boundaries of the system and play there. Because I think that in a way, I was hoping more and more for this kind of like boundaries to create their own language. So for instance, the sense of the glove, let's say, simple. Okay, first the mapping was, the reason it was a nightmare is because it was all hard-coded, if I move this finger, this does, if I do this, if that this, but this happened, but this. So it was this kind of solid, like concrete, kind of like, it just would be each piece would be a new, set of relationships. But then if I say move this finger, and if the wrist is like that, and if like that, okay. But then it turns out my little finger is going to move. And then little by little, I started realizing all those the leakages where what was interesting, the things that happen because I didn't program correctly, or because I didn't, think about it, or because whatever. So the outsides, the outside of the instruments became much more interesting. The edges became more interesting. So then it changed, obviously, with machine learning. The whole idea of the edges, it's a completely different way of thinking about it, but still it's trying to have the instrument teach you or bring you somewhere. I mean, you really don't want the instrument to do what you want. I mean, you kind of want, but you don't want it too much. It's a kind of it's a dance. I want you to do exactly what I said, but please don't do what I said. It surprised me. It's kind of like totally, mixed message that you're giving the instrument.
Yeah. To quote Rodrigo Constanzo again, he said that you want the excitement of going skydiving, but then again, you do want a parachute because you don't want to just fall to your death. But it's a very fine kind of balance.
Very fine. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah.
Great. And so the visual kind of Beaubourg center insides out kind of visuals of the glove are very intriguing and striking, and it kind of sort of harks back to that to what you were saying earlier about finding a certain kind of legitimacy in showing the physicalities of what's happening on stage and stuff, and it also kind of makes me think of sort of the live coding principle of show us your screens, kind of that this relationship that you have to have with the audience. I was wondering, I suppose, so you talked about it briefly then. I was wondering if you could talk about maybe that relationship that you have with the audience and how you curate what they see visually and why.
Yeah, again, I think it has changed. I mean, before, I think, again, with the glove, I was really kind of obviously creating I wanted to really create, frontal relationship, and also I was using text a lot, so it was really about delivery and kind of switching between senses, like it makes sense, it doesn't make sense, it makes sense, and trying to get people to forget about what makes sense and what not, getting to that point where you're just not trying to make sense, which is hard because as soon as you do a gesture, I mean, I think our brain is always trying to connect things. So at some point, to get this to the point where I want people to trust me and not try to, I want to legitimize somehow the gestures, but at some point, I also did not want people to use it as a benchmark, or to use it as a reference, and to eventually drop it. And I think it worked, sometimes, like just kind of eventually just like forget what is sound, what is gesture, what is text, what is abstract, trying to create this kind of place. But then I think I got tired of that relationship somehow. And I think that's when I mean, there's, again, many reasons, but one of the reasons with the glove is that, I don't want to have to, it's going to sound terrible, I don't want to have to look at you, I don't want to have to do this kind of, I want to go more, inwardly, I think. And I want it to be, it was never dramatic, but it still has a certain drama. And I was like, I don't want drama anymore, So I don't know if it was an age thing, just getting older, preparing for retirement and, sitting. But I think it was just this, I felt like I don't want to entertain you.
Yeah. And sort of staying on the visuals of the glove, but also on the gesture as well. I think, obviously very closely intertwined with that. So we saw that it began as a pair of kitchen gloves, and you've described it as being first somewhat of a joke, a response to the heavy masculine apparel used in virtual reality systems. So you've shown us the power glove that. So the instrument's still striking in its visual configuration, but now taking on perhaps different stereotypically feminine trait of refined elegance. And I'm curious to know how or if questions of gender enter into your work, notably in this field of electronic music where women are sadly underrepresented.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I never think of myself as political, but I think obviously my position and the relationship of, this, who controls the electronic music scene, who decides what is worth it and not, and it's changing because it's greatly open. But I think at the time, probably, yes, I was trying to, make some kind of a, fun, tongue-in-cheek, not so fun statement. And I think like in the future instruments, in the other instruments, there is always some kind of a, I think a bit of a, I cannot, I am who I am. And I think a lot of, obviously my expression comes from who I am, which in my case is, kind of a woman and how to say, identifying as a woman. And so I think that my instruments, without wanting it, are close connected to how I feel. So in that sense, it's kind of a joke, but it's also, political in the sense of like, let me make sure I express who I am. Wherever you are, let's make sure that you are there, So I think that, at the time, but it's interesting, it was there was a lot of problems also. It's changing a bit, but the idea of gesture too was considered to be, a gimmick, like, oh, serious music does not imply gesture, serious electronic music. And I think that maybe I went even more into this idea of the body because of that, so annoyed at it, but never saying it directly, but keep going my way. But I never thought exactly of making a statement. It's just thinking back, I was like, yeah, F you, I'm going to do my thing. But it was more like, later I was like, yeah, you're right, go there. But with the newer instrument, I think that it's a bit different. But it's always like trying to get close to who I am. I think we're all doing that. Whoever you are, whatever you are, how do you really go there in the instrument design, So I think like the new one, and we will talk about it later, has this emptiness, the empty space in the ring of metal. And I think that that's where I am, somehow this idea of emptiness and what comes out of that, So it's always trying to get somehow close with found material. There's nothing fancy about the material, whether it's kitchen gloves or these other things. Really feel, is it true to me?
Yeah. Now that idea of gesture and it is true that I won't say in what context, but I have come up against this idea where people can be quite resistant to the idea of gesture participating in how the audience and how the musician is going to perceive the sounds and the music, and people can be quite strident that that they're not linked at all, which is something I don't subscribe to.
It's tricky. And sometimes it works, sometimes it's not. Sometimes I see something and I go, why are you doing this gesture? It's like over so, it's so ridiculous. And sometimes I go, yeah. So it must be the state of, it must be how that person is really embodying their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just, yeah, it definitely pushes buttons because it's true. It can be so annoying, like, or you have to do this to make this, it's just, it definitely, a lot of prejudice around that.
Yeah. So as we've said, you've since discontinued Ladies Glove. So you communicated on some of the reasons at 9/2014. You explained that you had, I quote, stopped playing the Ladies Glove because your, as you mentioned earlier, imagination and the Ladies Glove had merged into one, and that gestures, sensors, sounds, sonic narratives, and emotions engraved themselves into prearranged patterns and became irresistible. So I think this is really interesting and also harks back to something I was discussing in the last episode of the podcast with Thor Magnusson, with the idea of instruments as objects of resistance, or rather objects that resist the player. So we've also touched on this a bit earlier as well. So you talk about inefficient and ineffective instruments which we learn to ride like wild bulls on a limitless plain. So I adore that idea, and I think it encapsulates one of the fundamental elements, in my opinion, that an artist must deal with, which is confronting their agency with the physicalities of the world. So I'd love to hear more about your views on this and how they feed perhaps into the conception of the instrument we'll be discussing next, which is Spring Spyre, which arose at that around that time.
Yeah, I think that again, like what I was saying, like with the Ladies Glove, I started really liking the leakages, the things that happen as a result of an action, and I think that this idea of like unpredictability or adaptation. I mean, the glove, in a way, a lot of things would happen, but it was, I kind of knew what it would do. I kind of expected certain things. So in a way, if we talk about resistance, I hadn't thought about it as in terms of resistance, but let's say talking back, yeah, resistance in the sense of feedback somehow onto the player. Then I felt like I was not surprised. I was rarely surprised, and I wanted to be surprised. And so I guess a lot of different things came together, but there was this idea of like, do you want to just do this so this happens? Like, I'm like, no, I want to do this so something I never imagined would happen. It's always this desire that suddenly you're going to be shown some world that does not exist. It's like you build an aircraft that's going to just like blow your mind. And so I think that there was this desire of wanting to be surprised. There was many things, but unpredictability and surprise was definitely somehow a desire, something more faster, something that I could maybe improvise with, something that I could just kind of like, learn to kind of move around. And so, so there was this desire. And I had always been interested in machine learning also. I'm not always interested. I had tried it in the 90s. Or maybe it was early 2000, I forget, with David Wessel at CinMat. They said, oh, we'll train your glove to, with the machine learning thing. But you needed the SGI, you needed like, so much computing power. And I was like, I can't travel with this stuff. And also it was like more about recognition, gesture recognition, train the system to know what this is, what this is, what this is, And I was like, oh, I'm not interested in training it to know what this is. I want to see what it does when it's like, this. So anyway, then I met, Rebecca Fibrink, and I was trying to think anyway about the glove might be coming to an end. It took me 25 years to get there. I think I'm pretty good at it, from, my own standards at least. And if it's going to take me 25 years to do another instrument, I better get started now, So it was like, okay, try that. And she said, she showed me her Wacinator, and I was like, because I was very, suspicious, that, it's going to be one of those systems that you need all this, that to make it work. And I was like, oh, this is kind of good. So that's when I said, I'll build something for your system. But I wanted to never learn. And she was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's good, which was interesting, for someone who's done a learning software. And I was like, I wanted to not learn because, again, I wanted to go in between. And obviously, my ideas have changed then, but, I wanted to never learn correctly. So that's when I just went through all the various iterations and tried to make an instrument that would allow me to just kind of adapt and be surprised by it. It kind of works, but it turns out it's mostly in the way you do your machine learning. You train your models.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear more about that. Perhaps quickly, just before we talk about the training, you could talk about the instrument itself. So just so that we're sort of framing it for everybody, people who may not have seen it yet. So the instrument, the spring Spyre. So you described earlier this metal
ring.
Ring. Sorry,
I have it. Maybe I can show you here with this great wrapping. It's a Louis Vuitton, they say. So that's just part of it, the ring. Yeah. So you can kind of tell,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So sorry, I interrupted you.
No. Yeah. Well, I was just wondering if you could quickly explain how the physical side of it works.
Yeah. Well, again, it's about attraction. Oddly enough, I was really interested in attraction, but actually I was really interested in magnets, which obviously is about attractions. And I was really fascinated with, again, not understanding exactly what's magnetic force, but I was just amazed how, you can just move a magnet in front of a coil and you get a sound. I mean, it just blows me away. It's still, I was just like talking the other day about also pickups for records. And I was like, that's insane, So, it's really just talking to you. I'm like, this is just, again, blows me away. I'm like, how do you get this variety of sounds, by just moving a magnet next to a coil? Anyway, so I was thinking of magnets and I was kind of really interested in that. And then I just started playing around what kind of magnets you can do. Again, my friend Paul Demernier said, oh, you can have a nail and coil a nail and move a magnet. And I was like, I tried that. And I tried a variety of things. I actually tried the game track controllers too. I wanted more flexibility. And then I started playing with reverb tank pickups, which is the little magnet, and they're cheap. And so I started playing with that. And so I went through I was really trying to not have any plan. I had no, it was just whatever I want, I'm going to do it. Obviously, whatever I want and whatever I can do, which is pretty limited as far as technology, but, money-wise or knowledge-wise. But, and then Rebecca also at the time was very interested, and she was still finishing some aspects of the Wacinator. So we actually worked together. She worked and I just kind of talked and and then I went through several design and then found this design again. I had been attracted by wheels and circles, and I had collected all these circles from, junkyards, not knowing what to do with it. So anyway, they all came together. And then, so it's 3 reverb tank pickups that are attached by long, thin springs. And then they're activated when I touch the spring. You never hear the springs. The springs are just there to activate the reverb tanks, the pickups. And then as you activate it, it sends an audio signal to the computer. And this audio signals, 3 audio signals, then there's feature extractions, is happening with the signal going through a set of biquads filters. So each signal is going to like 5 or 6 biquads because it's fast, it's cheap, CPU cheap. And then and the amplitude of each of those bandwidths, which are very narrow, is used to train the system. So it was a fairly simple system, and just kind of learning how to do this. Just learning from scratch. It's like I had to rethink completely my idea of sounds, my idea of what's possible, And I'm still, it's been like 6-7 years. I'm barely kind of feeling like I'm getting my head around it. So obviously I'm kind of slow, or I'm thinking too much about stuff. I don't know, but it's still, so that's how it works. And it's still a discovery, with the machine learning. And then I'm using Wakinator, and then using after Rapid Max, and I'm looking forward to use FluCoMa. But every time I lose my models, I think I was telling you before, I spend a lot of time. So there's not so much hardship in the hard mapping, like with the glove, but there's a lot of work in training to get something that will respond to the chaotic nature of the springs in an interesting way. And, it becomes like an instrument. Each training is kind of an instrument. And so, again, it's just, did I answer what you were asking?
Yeah, definitely.
Monologue.
No. Well, I'd love to get into hearing how you approach the training of the model. So Rebecca, in her keynote for FluCoMa, she offered the idea of small data being beautiful. I was wondering if that concept entered into your approach. I was wondering if you could talk about how you go about training the model. So the input, we've got these the audio signals, how do you approach training?
Yeah, I thought about this idea of small data is beautiful. I mean, small is beautiful is interesting. It has a lot of implications, which I'm not sure she was, thinking about. Like, does it have to be small to be beautiful? But it made me think, about other things. But I think that I understand where is the smallness? Is the smallness in extraction or in the application? I think that again, I think that in extraction, it would be really great. And actually, I've been playing now more with a thing that called the lattice ball, and the lattice ball is just another where the small is really small. The extraction is just accelerometer, just 3. So this desire for small is definitely there, but in the case of the Spring Spyre, small, it's 18 features. I find that's not small. It's actually maybe too much, and it's 3 times 6, and I think it's too much because I'm not sure it's all relevant. But anyway, like I'm not sure all the features I'm getting are relevant. But the way I do it is that I use MaxMSP, which I've used. I would love to know something else, but that's what I know. And then in a very crude way, even after all these years, And then actually, this I have to give a shout to this artist engineer Francesco Di Maggio, who I think has been also involved with FluCoMa, because he's trying to, he's not trying to, but he's been helping me rethink my max, because he's much more efficient at it than I am. And also the idea of, FluCoMa, which we can get back to later. But so I have this 18 features, and I mostly use this PAF synthesizer, which is a phase aligned format synthesis, which I have no idea how it works, but for some reason it has worked really well with the model, with the training. It was made by Miller Puckett, and it has a really nice analog sound, and also it doesn't die when the training goes out of boundaries, because people say use models break. I can't use models, it has to be fluid synthesis. So I use PAF, and then I set up like this I think I did this, how much after having used it now for like a few years, I was like really trying to create a balance between predictable models and unpredictable models, which I call the predictability index, which maybe other people talk like that about that, but I was very proud of my predictability index. I thought that sounds very academic and legitimate, I think I got a point there, like, yeah. Makes sense. Legitimate, no, predictability index. So, so it has this, try to get models that are very obviously restrained, and models that are very unbridled, and that's done by creating points that are very separate, very far from each other, synthesis points in the path. And then playing it, and then hearing what happens. And then hopefully, there's two things. One is training to really get a flexibility in the instrument that I can perform with. And, the other one is just to get new sounds, exploring, So I'm just like, well, let's see what it does, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, blah. Oh, that's strange. Blank. Shut off and stop it. Don't run it. Catch it. Store it. Go back. And so again, it's this idea of like, kind of like gathering, gathering what can happen, and hoping that my territory is like wide enough that I can gather new things, So that's kind of fun, like this idea of like, whoa, going places. And then once that's collected, just, again, trying to work through how much surprise I want when I perform. And if it's solo, it's probably has to be a bit more kind of clear where I am. If I do improvisations with others, I think I can allow myself to be more accidental. I don't know why. That's how I see it myself. So that's how it's done. Training is just this, and sometimes it's really good. Sometimes you get, oh, this is a really nice, sound, because the paths are interesting, that synthesis. And I keep on wanting to do FM, but every time I'm disappointed. I keep on wanting to do granular. Every time I'm disappointed. The path is like, I've done it for 5 years, but now I'm tired of the path. So I'm looking for something else. If anybody out there has a great idea, I would love to have put my hands on other sounds, other generations. So did I answer what you asked?
Yeah, definitely. But well, so sort of staying on this idea of synthesis techniques, you stated that a big challenge when using regression was finding synthesis techniques that take advantage of the technology. So the reason that you gave there was having things that don't just completely die when you throw unexpected sort of values at it. So I was wondering if you could maybe explain exactly what you mean by that, and how you approach choosing a synthesizer when you're in development.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing. I mean, like it used to be that we didn't have, control systems because we didn't have access to A to Ds or D to As, so we didn't have that. Then we got that, and now we can do, pretty much, I mean, it's still, the body, if you're doing the body, there's not that much you can do. But let's say you can build things. But now, it's like I'm in the opposite direction. When I started, I was like, wow, the computer can do several things at once. How come I only have a keyboard? Let's put the glove. The glove, I have 5 fingers. I can do 5 things at once. Great, I can access. And now it's a different, I guess, a reverse. I have to think about it, where I can do a lot of things. But the synthesis is, I find, still, limited. But probably people who are like, computer scientists, well, that's not true. But to me, it is. And I was like, why can't we have something a synthesis that takes the color of the sky, the humidity, how I feel on my skin. And these all would be parameters that would create, something. But I guess sound is sound, sound is just made with, partials. So obviously it's not like you can invent. But I think I would like to have kind of different ways of entering the sound, yeah, it probably doesn't really make sense, but sometimes I feel limited with the synthesis, I guess. I feel like I want something that has, I don't know. Some people are doing it well, like my friend John Bischoff doing the most amazing FM thing. It's amazing performer and player. And I'm like, those sounds are good. How are you doing that? And he's doing it in Max MSP and probably all FM. And so I guess it's my limitations. But I would like, to have access to a way, to kind of like control things differently. I mean, visual people have it, you get this Photoshop things, they have all these tools, take the eye drop, pick this up, make it fuzzy, make it this, make it that. And for us, it still is like kind of a limited approach, I feel. But I don't know if it's valid, but that's how I feel.
Yeah. No, I think I do understand what you mean. And it kind of leads me into a question that I wanted to ask you, sort of talking about, you're really talking about the subtleties of sound itself and the very kind of body of sound. Well, in an interview you gave in 2004 with Tara Rogers for her book Pink Noise, you mentioned some ideas on different approaches to instrument and sound design, and you offered what you described as a crude generalization, but one that, in my opinion, isn't without grounded truth. One where male artists would tend towards works that are system-based, with lots of work on the structure, and female artists would tend to explore the subtleties of sound itself. And I'm curious to hear more about that and perhaps learn how you see yourself in your own work regarding those ideas and that kind of balance.
Yeah. I mean, and this is 2004, you say, or 14, yeah. 4. Many things have happened since then, So that's 20 years, no, 18 years. So I think that many things have changed on many aspects, but I think that luckily there is much more female identified, composers on the scene. So I think it has opened up. It's not perfect. It's still, very limited on different aspects, but it's a bit better. So I think that it's not as valid then as now. Also, I think that the idea of gender it's also changed a bit. So I have to be careful. Already then it was a bit, straight. But from my experience then, in 2004, let's make sure everybody gets that, I'm talking 2004, my friends who were working, female artists, I felt had a very tendency to be very less systematic than my male friends. Again, there was, obviously other people like, I'm thinking Joel Ryan, for instance, his approach to sound is very much like, textural. But I think there was a tendency that, you had to be more systematic to be recognized, or more system-based to be recognized in the electronic music world. In that, we're talking again a very, we're not talking about, what was happening in the real world. We're talking about our academic experimental, world. I think now I would be more careful to venture this kind of ideas, to make generalizations, because generalization are more problematic and sensitive. So I think that, but for me, I can say that sound. I mean, I'm still not tired of sounds, not too, because sometimes but I'm still fascinated. And I think that the texture and the perception and how we encounter it, it's still fascinating, and it's endless, kind of lesson. So, yeah. So I'm trying to avoid the trap you set for me here.
I agree that it was obviously a generalization and a very long time ago, but yeah, no, it's I was curious, and regarding what you were saying before, to hear about this idea of working on the subtleties of the sound itself.
Yeah.
Great. So I was wondering, maybe as a last, perhaps more open question, kind of little touch back on a lot of the things we've been talking about. So in the same interview, you mentioned that you'd been trying to figure out at which point a controller becomes an instrument. So you offered the idea that an instrument would affect the way you think of the music or write the software. And in your 9 paper, you also suggested a difference between control systems and compositional tools. And you stated a desire to create instruments that allow for a new apprehension of composition and sound design and performance. So I was wondering if maybe to finish, you could expand on some of those ideas.
Yeah. So I think that, people think often of controller. And even now, when I try to teach machine learning, it's like something will go, oh, I have this great system, it's making great things, and I'm going to put machine learning or controller to guide it on top of it. Like it's the last thought, because you have this perfect thing, and now you're going to say, oh, yeah, I have to do something to play it. So I don't think it works like that. I think that the instrument, it would be like saying, well, instead of playing the piano, do you just play the, why don't you play the flute? Same thing. And it's like, I think each sound and each composition is, at least for me, totally linked to the instrument, and to even to the models. Because I recently, somebody says, oh, well, just use that model for this. I was like, no, the model was made for this particular instrument. I cannot just, it's going to be a different gesture. It's going to be a different, system. So I think that what you want in an instrument is something, again, that is an integral part of, for me, of the composition. The composition cannot be thought outside of the instrument, which seems to be pretty normal. You're right, for an orchestra or you're writing for a singer? I mean, it seems like, but for some reason, I think we had this idea that, again, the media is anonymous, and the media can be, applied to anything, because it's digital. There's no materiality to it. No, it's actually it has a body. It's a different body, but it has a body. So I think that a controller is controlling things. People want buttons. I understand. I want buttons too. To know, I'd love to have buttons. I always want to have more buttons. I resisting buttons because it's a fight. I don't want to be button. Do this, but I sure I would love that more. And I keep on thinking maybe I can add one more. It's trying to stick with what you have, and so that's a controller system. You're controlling some thing that you have. Interface. You're kind of trying to start thinking of both end of the systems. But an instrument, I guess, even though sometimes that feels very, instrument. For some reason, it's like it's like, yeah. It has a certain arrogance to it, but still, let's call it instrument. It's something that it's the space you live in. It's the sonic space you live in is the instrument, and again, it's the gesture, and gestures. In my case, at least, and probably a lot of other people, cannot be dissociated from sound. So in that case, the instrument and the gestures become an integral part of how you start thinking. Now, it doesn't mean that when you compose, you're not obviously still thinking about, if you're doing of shape and transitions and form and density and, all these things. So that's still obviously same problem as everybody else. But how you're going to manage those is really dependent on the instruments. That's why, for instance, with the glove, I was saying, well, I cannot do certain things, which I would love to do. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll have to design a new system that allows me to do that. Does that make sense?
Definitely, yeah. No, it's been fascinating to hear about how you kind of work and exist in this balance between functionality and embodied kind of existence. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and just to give it, just to acknowledge very quickly, this is a FluCoMa podcast. I just want to say that it looks like amazing, and I'm looking forward to learn it. Again, I have to adapt. I have to start from scratch my models.
Well, maybe there's a talented coder in the audience who'd like to take up the challenge of doing some kind of Wackinator to FluCoMa conversion kind of.
There are other issues. There are other issues than just there's but we don't have to go into the issues too much at this point. But it would be great. But no, I'm actually curious to just learn it. I mean, it's amazing the amount of tools. It's like whoa, wow. It's like I don't know, Max MSP could do all this. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, well, no, I think there's certainly many elements that would fit into your practice quite well. You were talking about the feature extraction. Obviously, there's lots of tools for that, and obviously the MLP and all the kind of scaling and stuff, and also maybe dimensionality reduction as well. And you were talking about 18 dimensions perhaps being too much, and there's many ways to approach all these different problems.
It's so hard because you spend so much time, learning a new, in this case, really a new instrument, and then somebody comes along and says, hey, did you try this? And you go, oh, God. It's like, it's a whole environment. And every time it's because, again, if you want to be exploring and then new things happen and you go, oh my God, what am I going to do with this? This sounds good. What am I doing? It's like every time it's such a challenge. No end.
One of the difficult yet thoroughly stimulating parts of operating in the domain of creative coding.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Laetitia, so much. It's been really, really good. I think really looking forward to seeing how Spring Spire will be developing in the near future, and Ladies Ball as well, and all your other projects. So everything that we've talked about today will be linked down below on the Learn platform page where this podcast will be living, and there's also a link in the description of the YouTube video to that, so people will be able to find everything that we've discussed, and of course links to all of the places and online things where you can find Laetitia and her work. So Laetitia, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Just in time for the match.
France-Maroc, indeed. Okay, thanks a lot. I'll speak to you again soon.
Ciao, ciao.